My sister? Oh, she's a doctor, the kind that works at the Fort Bragg Country Club. The room erupted in laughter, but then I heard my mother's laugh joining in. It was proud, it was genuine, and it stopped my heart cold. But they didn't know about the classified letter in my pocket. The nomination for the Silver Star that I couldn't speak of yet. My name is Captain Sarah Harper. I'm 33 years old, and tonight I was navigating a battlefield far more treacherous than any I'd ever faced as a trauma surgeon in the U.S. Army. The air in the restaurant was thick with the sound of forced cheerfulness. It was the specific, high-pitched hum of a 15-year high school reunion. A blend of clinking wine glasses, booming laughter that didn't quite reach the eyes, and the desperate exchange of life updates. We were at a chic, overpriced steakhouse in North Hills, Raleigh, a place with dark wood paneling and lighting so dim it was meant to flatter, to smooth over the fine lines and the quiet disappointments of the last decade and a half. In this room, I wasn't Captain Harper. I was just Sarah, the quiet, studious girl who no one quite remembered. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the need to arrange my features into a mask of pleasant neutrality, a skill I'd honed to perfection over a lifetime. My brother, Daniel, was holding court near the bar. Even in civilian clothes, a crisp polo shirt and expensive jeans, he radiated the cocksure arrogance of a paratrooper from the 82nd Airborne Division. He was the golden boy, the hero, and the crowd around him was a testament to his gravitational pull. My parents stood nearby, my father beaming, my mother watching her son with an expression of pure adoration. Then a voice cut through the noise, sharp and coated in designer perfume. "Sarah, oh my God, is that you?" It was Jessica, a former cheerleader whose life seemed to have peaked in the 12th grade. She glided toward me, her designer dress shimmering under the low lights. "I heard you're in the Army too? That's so brave. Still a nurse?" The question hung in the air, a casual, condescending jab. Before I could form a reply, before I could correct her and state my title, my rank, my years of medical school, and brutal residency, Daniel's voice boomed across the group, silencing everyone. He raised his half-empty bottle of beer like a trophy. "She's a captain, actually," he announced, and for a split second, a foolish, naive part of me felt a flicker of hope, a flicker of pride. It was extinguished instantly. "A doctor, the whole 9 yards," he continued, a smirk playing on his lips. "But you know, she's the safe kind of doctor. Stationed at the Fort Bragg Country Club, patching up little scratches and sprained ankles, while the rest of us are jumping out of planes into actual combat zones." The words landed, and a wave of laughter erupted from the crowd. It wasn't a gentle chuckle. It was a loud, braying roar of amusement. The sound felt physical, like 1,000 tiny needles pricking my skin, a wave of heat rising from my neck to my cheeks. I just stood there, my lips frozen in a robotic smile I didn't recognize as my own. My training, my years of facing life and death situations with a steady hand, had taught me to control my exterior. Inside, I was shattering. My eyes, desperate for an anchor, for a single ally in the room, found my mother. I was searching for a sign. A slight frown, a subtle shake of her head, anything to signal her disapproval of Daniel's public cruelty. I found nothing. My mother was smiling. It wasn't a strained, polite smile you give when your son makes an inappropriate joke. It was genuine, authentic. It was a smile of pure, undiluted pride in her son's cleverness, in his cutting humor. That smile was a verdict. It told me, without a single word, that in her eyes, Daniel's statement wasn't an insult. It was just a fact, an amusing, self-evident truth. To her, he was the hero, and I was the footnote. Then my father sealed it. He reached out and slapped Daniel on the back, a hearty, affirming thud of masculine approval. "That's my boy," his gesture screamed. In that one searing moment, the laughter, the smile, the slap on the back, it all coalesced into a single, devastating realization. I wasn't just being overlooked, I was invisible, utterly and completely invisible. My entire existence, the grueling years at West Point, the crushing debt from medical school, the nights spent standing over an operating table for 36 hours straight, my hands deep inside a soldier's chest, fighting to stitch a life back together. All of it was just a faint, insignificant backdrop for my brother's brilliant stage presence. A voice from my past echoed in my mind, a memory from a stern instructor at West Point. "Honor," he'd told our class of nervous cadets, "is not found in the applause. It's found in the actions no one sees." I clung to that sentence like a life raft in a churning sea of humiliation. It was the only thing that kept the robotic smile plastered on my face, the only thing that stopped my shoulders from slumping in defeat. It was the shield that protected the last fragile sliver of my dignity. But even as I held onto it, I felt myself receding, fading into the expensive wallpaper of the restaurant, becoming nothing more than a ghost at my own life's reunion. That night, back in the sterile silence of my Raleigh hotel room, the polite, professional mask I wore finally crumbled. The feeling of being invisible at the reunion wasn't a fresh wound, it was the tearing open of old scars. Staring at the generic art on the wall, I let the memories I had so carefully suppressed begin to surface, replaying themselves with cruel clarity. The humiliation I felt tonight wasn't a standalone event, it was a pattern, a map of inequity drawn over the entire landscape of my life. I remembered a sweltering North Carolina summer from years ago. The air was thick with the scent of hickory smoke and freshly cut grass. My parents had thrown a massive backyard barbecue for Daniel. He had just earned his jump wings, his first parachute certification, and the entire neighborhood was there to celebrate. The yard was filled with a sea of familiar faces, the sound of lawn chairs scraping against the patio, and the endless booming debates over whether the UNC Tar Heels or the Duke Blue Devils would dominate the coming football season. Daniel was the center of it all, a young god in a halo of admiration. That same week, I had received an email. My research paper on advanced battlefield hemostatic techniques had been accepted for publication in the Journal of Military Medicine. It was the culmination of months of painstaking work, a significant achievement for a young Army doctor. My heart hammered with pride. I practically sprinted home from the base, bursting to share the news. I found my father by the grill, a beer in his hand, laughing with our next-door neighbor. "Dad, look," I said, my voice trembling with excitement as I held out my phone, the email glowing on the screen. He glanced at it, his eyes skimming the first line. "That's nice, honey," he said, the words a perfunctory pat on the head. He gave a single dismissive nod and immediately turned back to our neighbor. Anyway, like I was saying, you can't imagine the guts it takes, jumping from 250 feet. My son, Daniel, he's a real hero. My phone, with my name and accomplishment displayed on its screen, felt impossibly heavy in my hand. I lowered it slowly. Later, I found it on the kitchen counter where I'd left it, right next to a half-eaten bowl of my mom's potato salad. Unseen, unimportant. Then another memory, sharper and more recent, pushed its way forward. Last Christmas, My father's heart condition had been a constant source of anxiety for me. Using nearly my entire holiday bonus, I bought him a top-of-the-line smartwatch, a sleek device that could monitor his ECG, blood oxygen levels, and even detect a fall. It was a gift of concern, a gift of love, a piece of technology that could genuinely protect him. Daniel's gift to him was a military-grade combat knife, its handle engraved with his name and the 82nd Airborne insignia. Throughout the entire holiday vacation, my father wore that knife on his belt with an air of profound pride. He showed it to every relative who walked through the door, recounting the imagined stories of bravery it represented. My gift, the smartwatch, remained in its pristine box, tucked away in his sock drawer. When I finally gathered the courage to ask my mother why he wasn't using it, she sighed a soft, weary sound. She placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, her touch meant to be comforting but feeling more like a quiet dismissal. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice laced with the patronizing wisdom of someone explaining a fundamental law of nature. "It's a man thing. They don't need complicated gadgets. They need things that make them feel strong." Her words didn't just dismiss my gift, they dismissed me. They dismissed my intelligence, my concern, my very nature as a daughter who wanted to care for her father. In her world, strength was a performance, a symbol like a knife. It wasn't the quiet, steady strength of a doctor's mind, or the profound strength of love. Lying there in the dark hotel room, these memories weren't just sad stories. They were data points on a chart, proving a consistent, painful hypothesis. In my family's universe, my brother was the sun, and I was a distant, cold planet, only visible when my orbit happened to reflect a bit of his light. A quote from Theodore Roosevelt I'd read long ago echoed in my mind. "It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood." I had always identified with that man. I was in the arena every single day. But what happens when the arena is your own home? What do you do when the fight isn't for victory, but for the simple acknowledgement that you exist? How do you even begin to fight a battle like that? The questions I had asked myself in that lonely hotel room had no easy answers. So upon returning to the familiar, rigid order of Fort Bragg, I did the only thing I knew how to do. I buried myself in work. Work was my refuge. It was logical, methodical, and fair. In the operating room, there were no golden children, only patience. Success wasn't measured in applause, but in steady heartbeats and stable vital signs. For a week, I immersed myself in the demanding rhythm of my duties. The long hours a welcome anesthetic for the throbbing ache in my soul. Then came the Nightingale Scramble. It was a high-stress mass casualty simulation designed to push us to our breaking points. The scenario was a catastrophic IED blast. The training ground was suddenly a chaotic hellscape of smoke machines, deafening sound effects, and the convincing, blood-curdling screams of a dozen soldiers role-playing horrific injuries. The air was thick with synthetic smoke and the metallic tang of fake blood. Several of the younger medics looked overwhelmed, their eyes wide with panic. That's when I heard the voice, a low, condescending murmur meant just for me. "All right, let's see how the desk jockey doctor handles some real action." It was Sergeant Kevin Walsh, one of Daniel's closest friends, a man who believed that courage was measured solely in testosterone and bravado. He stood nearby, arms crossed over his chest, a smug look on his face. The old sting of being underestimated, of being judged before I'd even begun, pricked at me. But then my training took over. The noise, the chaos, the personal insults. It all faded into the background. My world narrowed to the task at hand. There was only the mission. "All right, listen up." My voice cut through the din, sharp and authoritative, devoid of any emotion. "We're initiating start triage now. Medics, I want reds tagged and moved to the forward surgical area, yellows to staging, greens to the perimeter. Go." I moved through the chaos with a focused calm, my mind a cold, calculating machine. I knelt beside a young soldier with a simulated femoral artery bleed, my fingers working quickly to apply a tourniquet. I barked orders at the nurses, directing them with a steady, unwavering hand. I saw a figure on the ground, a training mannequin representing a soldier with an obstructed airway. Without hesitation, I performed a rapid cricothyrotomy, creating an emergency airway in the mannequin's throat in under 60 seconds. Every action was precise, economical, and driven by years of relentless practice. When the whistle finally blew, signaling the end of the exercise, a sudden, profound silence fell over the field. My ears were ringing. My scrubs were stained with sweat and fake blood. As I stood up, catching my breath, the supervising officer, a stern, no-nonsense full-bird colonel, walked directly toward me, his expression unreadable. Sergeant Walsh watched from a distance, a faint smirk still lingering on his face. The colonel stopped in front of me. He looked me up and down, his gaze taking in my disheveled appearance. Then he extended his hand. "Good work, Captain," he said, his voice a low rumble of approval. "That was damned professional. You kept a cool head in a hot situation." I shook his hand, my own grip firm. "Thank you, sir." It was a simple acknowledgement, but coming from him, it felt like a medal. Later, as I was wiping the sweat from my brow in the debriefing area, a figure appeared at my side. It was Dr. Lisa Chen, another captain in the medical corps. She was quiet, whip-smart, and known for her sharp wit, and even sharper scalpel. She wordlessly handed me a cold bottle of water. "Don't mind Walsh," she said, her voice low and direct. She nodded toward the group of paratroopers who were now laughing loudly in the corner. "Those airborne guys only understand muscle. They can't comprehend that up here," she tapped her temple with a finger, "is the most powerful weapon on the battlefield." I looked at her, surprised. In all our time working together, we'd barely exchanged more than professional pleasantries. But there was no mockery in her eyes, only a quiet, steady understanding. For the first time since the reunion, someone was seeing me. Not Daniel's sister, not a desk jockey, but a fellow doctor, a fellow soldier, a peer. A verse my grandmother used to read to me from her worn Bible surfaced in my memory. A whisper from my childhood. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Lisa's simple words, her small act of kindness, felt like the first fulfillment of that promise. It was like earning the first coin in a world that had only ever shown me debt. It wasn't much. It was a single bottle of water and a few sentences of validation. But it was real. It was mine. And for the first time in a long time, it gave me hope. The days following the training exercise were a blur of exhaustion. I'd picked up an extra 24-hour shift in the ER, a punishing marathon of controlled chaos that left me feeling hollowed out, my bones aching with a weariness that sleep couldn't touch. As I finally walked out of the hospital, the pre-dawn sky a bruised purple, my only thought was of my Spartan barracks room and the sweet oblivion of my bed. I just wanted to collapse. "Harper, hold up." I turned. Dr. Lisa Chen was walking toward me, her own face etched with fatigue, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. She stopped in front of me, blocking my path to escape. "You look like hell," she stated, not with pity, but with the frank assessment of a fellow physician. "Come on, I'm buying you dinner." "Lisa, it's 5 in the morning," I managed, my voice raspy. "And I think it's technically breakfast." "Dinner, breakfast, I don't care what you call it. You're not going back to your room to stare at the ceiling, let's go." I was too tired to argue. I expected her to lead me to one of the 24-hour diners off base, a place filled with sticky tables and the smell of stale coffee. Instead, she guided me toward the mess hall. At this hour it was nearly deserted, a vast, quiet space that felt strangely peaceful. A steady rain had begun to fall outside, drumming a soft, hypnotic rhythm against the large windows. We sat at a small table in the corner, under a single, dim yellow light that pooled around us like a small island of warmth. Lisa didn't go to the hot food line. Instead, she opened her own rucksack and pulled out 2 plastic containers. She pushed one toward me. Inside was a simple meal of grilled chicken and steamed broccoli, homemade. "My mom still mails me these care packages," she said with a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "She thinks I'll starve otherwise." We ate in a comfortable silence, though only sounds the soft clinking of our forks and the relentless drumming of the rain outside. The storm felt a world away. Here, in our little bubble of light, it was calm, it was safe. Lisa didn't ask about the reunion. She didn't ask about my family, or why I always seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. She talked about work. She asked about a complex trauma case we had both been consulted on. A soldier with a shattered pelvis. We discussed treatment protocols, surgical options, the fine points of medicine that formed the foundation of our shared world. "That move you made with the femoral artery shunt during the Nightingale scramble," she said, pausing with her fork midway to her mouth. "That was brilliant. I've read about it, but I've never seen it done that cleanly under pressure." I actually learned something. The compliment landed with a quiet, profound impact. It wasn't flattery, it wasn't a comparison. It was a simple statement of professional respect from someone I admired, someone whose opinion mattered. And it was the one thing in that moment of utter exhaustion that my defenses had no answer for. A single hot tear slid down my cheek, then another. I quickly ducked my head, mortified, but the dam had broken. The tears I had swallowed at the reunion, the tears I had choked back in my lonely hotel room, they all came spilling out now, a silent, shuddering testament to years of pent-up pain. I waited for the awkwardness, the uncomfortable shifting, the clumsy attempt at consolation. It never came. Instead, Lisa simply reached across the table and placed her hand gently on my shoulder. She just sat there, her presence a silent, solid anchor in my storm. After a long moment, she finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. "They don't see it, do they?" I looked up, my vision blurred. I didn't have to ask who they were. "They see the uniform," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "But they don't see the price you pay to wear it. They don't see the nights you don't sleep, the life and death decisions you make in a split second, the sheer weight of the burden we carry. They don't see any of that." She gave my shoulder a light squeeze. "But I see it. We all see it, Sarah." Her words weren't pity. They were a confirmation, a validation from one soldier to another, one healer to another. It was the simple, powerful truth. She saw. It's a strange and powerful thing, isn't it? We spend our lives conditioned to believe that family is the one place we are supposed to be unconditionally loved and understood. Have you ever had a moment where you realized you can also find that connection, that true sense of belonging, in the most unexpected of places, with the most unexpected of people? In that moment, sitting in a drab, nearly empty mess hall on a rainy Tuesday morning, sharing a plastic container of chicken and broccoli with a colleague, I felt more seen, more understood, and more a part of a family than I ever had in my entire life back in Raleigh. The quiet warmth of Lisa's friendship stayed with me for days. A small, glowing ember in the cold emptiness of my chest. It was a fragile peace, a tentative hope that perhaps my value wasn't determined by the family I was born into, but by the one I was slowly building for myself, one act of mutual respect at a time. I found myself replaying our conversation in the mess hall, her simple words, "I see it," acting as a shield against the lingering sting of the reunion. I held on to that feeling, nurturing it like a delicate seedling, determined to protect it from the harsh realities I knew were waiting just outside the gates of Fort Bragg. And then, on a rare Saturday off, the phone rang, and the frost returned to reclaim its territory. I was in my small, sparsely decorated apartment, a book lying open and unread in my lap, the silence a welcome balm. The caller ID flashed on the screen, Mom. An involuntary knot of apprehension instantly tightened in my stomach, a conditioned response I'd carried since childhood. It was the feeling of an impending test, one I knew I was destined to fail no matter how I answered. I let it ring twice, a small futile act of defiance, before taking a deep breath to fortify myself. "Hello? Sarah, honey." Her voice flowed through the phone, as sweet and thick as warm honey. It was her special occasion voice, the one she used when she wanted something. A syrupy tone designed to disarm, to remind me of my role as the dutiful, compliant daughter. "Your father and I were just talking about how proud we are of Daniel. That reunion was just wonderful, wasn't it? Everyone was so impressed with him." I stayed silent, gripping the phone tighter. The silence was my only defense. I listened to the unspoken words hanging in the air, the vast empty space where a question about my own well-being should have been. There was no, "How are you, Sarah?" No, "Are you okay after what happened?" There was only Daniel, always Daniel. The small ember of peace inside me began to cool, the hope flickering violently under the weight of her casual, complete disregard. "Anyway, sweetie," she continued, her voice bright and cheerful, oblivious to the chasm she was widening between us. "Daniel has a 3-day pass this weekend, and we were thinking of having a few of his friends over for a little get-together on Sunday. You know, a proper celebration for him. It would be so wonderful if you could drive down. I could really use your help getting everything ready. You're always so good with the details." The request hung in the air, so audacious, so utterly tone-deaf, that my mind struggled to process it. I stood frozen in the middle of my living room, the phone pressed hard against my ear, a sudden icy chill seeping into my bones, far colder than the sterile air of the operating room. She wanted me. After being publicly humiliated by my brother, she wanted me to sacrifice my one day of rest, to drive 3 hours south, to serve as unpaid catering staff for a party celebrating that same brother, a party for the very friends who had laughed in my face. The cold, disbelieving silence stretched on. "Mom, I'm tired," I finally said, my voice barely a whisper, hoarse with a fatigue that went far beyond lack of sleep. It was a soul-deep exhaustion. I just came off a very long shift. The sigh on the other end of the line was a masterpiece of dramatic, maternal martyrdom. It was a sound freighted with years of practiced disappointment and quiet accusation. "Sarah, don't be so selfish. This is family. And sometimes, in a family, we have to put the needs of others before our own. You know that. Your brother has sacrificed so much for this country. He's been through so much. Can't you sacrifice just a little bit of your time for him?" And there it was, the final drop, the last killing thrust, the accusation that my exhaustion was a moral failing, the implication that my service, my sacrifices were nothing, a footnote to his, the weaponization of the sacred word family to demand my compliance and invalidate my pain. It was the last drop in a glass that had been filled to the brim for a lifetime. In that instant, something inside me snapped. The bone-deep weariness that had clung to me for weeks didn't just disappear, it was incinerated by a sudden, clarifying rage. It was a cold fire, a brilliant, terrifying clarity that lit up every dark, dusty corner of our family's dysfunction. The hurt, the sadness, the desperate lifelong yearning for their approval. It all vanished, turning to ash. What remained was the stark, unvarnished, and finally liberating truth. They would never change. They would never see me. I wasn't a daughter to them. I was a function, a utility, a supporting character in the grand, heroic epic of my brother's life, expected to appear on cue to set the stage, play my part, and then disappear quietly into the wings. The realization didn't break my heart. It forged it into something new, something hard, something cold and unyielding. I brought the phone back to my lips. When I spoke, the voice that emerged was unfamiliar, even to my own ears. It wasn't shaky or emotional. It was level, calm, and as cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "I won't be there," I said. "I have work to do." And before she could unleash another sigh, another accusation, another single drop of her sweet, poisonous guilt, I pressed the red icon on the screen. The click of the call ending was the loudest, most definitive sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a lock turning, the sound of a chain breaking. After the call ended, I stood perfectly still in the center of my living room for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing in on me. The phone in my hand was cold and inert. There was no aftermath of tears, no trembling hands, no violent urge to throw something against the wall. The storm of emotion that had threatened to capsize me for years had finally passed, leaving behind a strange and profound calm. The anger was still there, a current running deep beneath the surface. But it wasn't a hot, chaotic rage. It was cold. It was the focused, precise anger of a surgeon who has identified a cancer and knows with absolute certainty that it must be excised. There was no more room for doubt, no more space for the faint, treacherous whisper of hope that things might one day be different. The diagnosis was final. The disease of their perception was chronic and incurable. My movements, when they finally came, were deliberate, each action flowing into the next, with a newfound, almost serene sense of purpose. I walked into my bedroom, my footsteps silent on the cheap apartment carpet, and opened my closet door. 2 uniforms hung side by side, a silent, stark testament to the 2 lives I led. On the left was my Army combat uniform, the digital camouflage fabric faded and softened from countless hours of training exercises in the sprawling forests of Fort Bragg. It perpetually smelled faintly of dust, pine needles, and the metallic tang of hard work. It was the uniform of my daily existence, a symbol of grit and sweat, and the unglamorous reality of my profession. It was practical, comfortable, and utterly devoid of ceremony. And on the right, pristine and protected in a clear plastic garment bag, was my ASU, the Army service uniform. It was a creature of deep, formal blue wool, a shade so dark it was almost black in the dim light of the closet. Its tailored jacket and razor-sharp trouser creases spoke of discipline and tradition. Adorning the chest were the neat, colorful, and tightly packed rows of my service ribbons. For years I had kept it hidden away, zipped inside its protective sheath like a secret I was ashamed of. I rarely wore it unless absolutely required by regulations. In my mind, it was an invitation for comparison, a lightning rod for the casual cruelty of my family's preferred narrative. To them, it was just a costume, a pale, inferior imitation of the real soldierly glory that belonged to my brother, the combat arms paratrooper. I had kept it in the dark to avoid the inevitable remarks, the belittling jokes, the faint praise that always felt more like an insult. But now, as I slid the closet door open wider and let the light fall upon it, I saw it with new, unclouded eyes. This wasn't a costume. It wasn't an object of potential shame or a tool for empty boasting. It was evidence. It was my service record, rendered in fabric and thread. Each ribbon was a chapter in the story they refused to read. The Army Commendation Medal, the National Defense Service Medal, the Global War on Terrorism Service Medal. Each tiny colored bar represented years of my life, grueling study, sleepless nights, and the sacred, unspoken oath I had taken to care for the soldiers placed in my charge. This uniform wasn't about seeking their approval. It was a factual, tangible record of my service, my dedication, my reality. A reality my family had so willfully and consistently chosen to ignore. My decision, which had been forming in the cold fire of my anger, now solidified into a plan. I moved from the closet to my desk and powered on my government-issued laptop. The machine whirred to life, its security protocols demanding a series of complex passwords that I typed with fluid, practiced motions. Once on the secure network, I navigated through layers of encrypted folders until I found what I was looking for. A single file, its name a simple string of letters and numbers. AirOp Thunderstrike 22-4. After Action Report. Operation Thunderstrike. The file was stamped with a bold red digital banner across the top. Top Secret had classified. I stared at the warning, the words pulsing slightly on the screen. Military law and a lifetime of ingrained discipline forbade me from ever speaking of the specific details contained within that report. I could never tell the full story to anyone outside a secure, windowless room. I didn't have to. I knew what was in it. I knew what had happened under the searing Afghan sun 3 weeks ago. I knew the truth. The words of Theodore Roosevelt, the ones that had been my quiet comfort for so long, echoed in my head again. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena. But this time, the words weren't a consolation prize for the unseen. They were a call to arms, a summons to step into the light. I had spent my entire life cowering in the shadows of their narrative, allowing their version of my story to become the accepted truth through my own silence. I had let them define me, no more. I would not fight them with their weapons, not with insults or guilt or emotional blackmail. I would fight them with mine, with the truth, with the quiet, undeniable, and documented weight of my own actions. With methodical precision, I reached into the closet and unzipped the garment bag. The soft zip of the plastic was a satisfying sound. I carefully lifted the ASU from its hanger, the heavy wool cool and substantial against my fingertips. I carried it to the hook on the back of my bedroom door and hung it up, smoothing the shoulders of the jacket with my palms. It hung there, a silent, powerful sentinel in the dim light. its polished brass buttons gleaming like distant stars. I would go back. I would return to the reunion for its final night. I would walk into that room not as Daniel's sister, not as the family footnote, but as Captain Sarah Harper, Medical Corps, United States Army. I wouldn't have to say a word. I would let the uniform and all it represented speak for me. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The air was still and cool, filled with a sense of quiet anticipation. Today was the day. I didn't feel anger or sadness, only a profound and steady sense of focus. I began my preparations with the methodical precision of a surgeon scrubbing in for a critical operation. Every step was a ritual, a deliberate act of arming myself for the battle ahead. First, the uniform. I laid the deep blue jacket and trousers of my ASU on my perfectly made bed. With a hot iron, I went over every inch of the fabric, ensuring each crease was as sharp as a scalpel's edge. There could be no imperfections, no sign of haste or neglect. This uniform was my armor, and it had to be flawless. Next, my shoes. I took my black leather Oxfords and worked the polish into them in small concentric circles, buffing them with a soft cloth, until they shone with a mirror-like finish. It was a meditative act, a discipline ingrained in me since my first days as a cadet. A soldier's readiness, I was taught, is reflected in the state of their boots. Then came the ribbons. I carefully removed the ribbon rack from the jacket and inspected each one. The Army Commendation Medal, the National Defense Service Medal, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal with its 2 Bronze Service Stars, the Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, the Army Service Ribbon. Each tiny bar of color was a story, a marker of time and place, a silent testament to a sacrifice my family had never bothered to acknowledge. I wasn't arranging them for them. I was arranging them for me, reaffirming my own history piece by piece. My weapon for this confrontation wasn't going to be a volley of bitter words or a tide of vengeful accusations. My weapon was the quiet, unimpeachable truth of who I was. It was the professionalism and dignity they had tried and failed to strip from me. As I was pinning the rack back onto the jacket, my phone buzzed. It was Lisa. "You ready for this, warrior?" she asked, her voice calm and steady through the speaker. A small, genuine smile touched my lips. "More than ever," I replied. "Good," she said. "Remember what you are. Let them see it. Call me when it's over." The call ended. I stood in front of the mirror, fully dressed. The woman staring back at me was not the hesitant, invisible girl from the first night of the reunion. This was Captain Sarah Harper. I looked ready. I felt ready. The drive from Fayetteville to Raleigh on Interstate 40 East is a straight shot, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the endless pine forests of North Carolina. It was a journey from one world to another, from the rigid, ordered reality of Fort Bragg to the messy, emotional chaos that awaited me in my hometown. I turned on the radio to WNC, the local public radio station. A calm, measured voice was discussing state politics, followed by a story about an upcoming local arts festival. The world was continuing on its axis, blessedly normal and completely indifferent to the personal war I was driving toward. The mundane stories were a strange comfort, a reminder that my family's drama was not the center of the universe. It was just a small, broken part of my own life that I was finally going to fix. With every mile that passed, I rehearsed my mission parameters in my head. I was not going there to start a fight. I was not going there to beg for an apology or seek their acceptance. That ship had sailed, sunk, and now rested on the ocean floor. I was going for a different reason entirely. I was going there to be present, to exist fully and unapologetically in my own skin, to stand in my truth without shrinking, without hiding, without asking for permission. My presence in that uniform would be my statement, a memory surfaced unbidden, a training session with Colonel Reynolds, my commanding officer. A commander's calm is the most strategic weapon on the field, he had told us. Never ever let the enemy see you panic. Your composure is their chaos. I held on to that thought. I would be calm, I would be composed, I would be in control. As I took the exit for North Hills, the familiar landscape of upscale boutiques and manicured lawns felt alien. I drove into the parking lot of the steakhouse, the same lot I had pulled into just 2 nights before. It was filled with luxury cars, BMWs, Mercedes, shiny SUVs that screamed of suburban success. The muffled sound of music and laughter drifted out from the entrance. My heart began to beat a little faster, a steady, rhythmic thumping against my ribs. I put the car in park and sat for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I could see them through the large front window, a laughing, drinking, celebrating crowd. My family was in there. My brother was in there, soaking in the glory. I took one last deep breath, the air cool and clean in my lungs. Then I reached for the coat of my uniform, which I had carefully hung on the hook in the back. I shrugged it on, the familiar weight settling on my shoulders like a mantle of strength. I adjusted the collar, smoothed the front, and looked at my reflection in the dark screen of my phone. It was time. I pushed open the heavy glass door of the restaurant and stepped inside. A wave of warm air, thick with the scent of grilled steak and expensive perfume, washed over me. The low hum of conversation and laughter immediately faltered as heads began to turn. My entrance had the effect of a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples of silence spread outward from the door. My eyes scanned the room. Daniel was in the middle of a story, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his audience captivated. I saw Sergeant Walsh beside him, laughing. I saw Jessica, her eyes widening in disbelief. And I saw my parents, their smiles freezing on their faces as they took in the sight of me, standing there in the full, formal regalia of my Army service uniform. I was no longer invisible. I didn't smile. I didn't approach them. I simply stood my ground, my posture perfect, my gaze level. I let the uniform do the talking. I let the silence stretch, becoming heavy and uncomfortable for everyone but me. This was my arena now. Daniel recovered first, his arrogance a reflex. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he said, his voice a little too loud. "Decided to show up after all, huh? And in costume, no less." Some of his friends snickered, but the laughter was hesitant, uncertain. They could sense the shift in the atmosphere. It was at that exact moment that my phone began to vibrate in my pocket. A low, insistent buzz. I pulled it out, my movements calm and deliberate. The screen lit up, and the words on it seemed to glow with an otherworldly power. "Call Reynolds, secure line." My heart gave a single, hard thump against my ribs. A secure line. I saw Daniel's eyes flick down to my phone screen. I saw the smirk on his face tighten just for a second. He and Walsh, as military men, knew what that meant. It wasn't a casual call. I turned my back on the room and walked to a relatively quiet corner, my polished shoes making no sound on the thick, plush carpet. I answered the call. "Reynolds, sir," I said, my voice steady, professional. "Captain Harper," Colonel Reynolds's voice came through, crisp and all business. There were no pleasantries. "Is this a bad time?" An idea, reckless and sudden, sparked in my mind. It was an impulse born of a lifetime of being silenced. Not at all, sir. In fact, if you don't mind, I'm putting you on speaker. I pressed the button, my thumb firm. I turned to face the room again, holding the phone out slightly. My gaze met my mother's, then my father's, then Daniel's. The colonel's voice, now amplified, boomed into the stunned silence of the restaurant. It was a voice accustomed to command, a voice that tolerated no interruption. Captain Harper, I'm calling to inform you that per directive from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the White House has officially approved your nomination for the Silver Star. A collective gasp went through the room. The air crackled with a new electric tension. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's face, which had been a mask of disapproval, was now slack with shock. I saw Jessica's glass of red wine slip from her fingers, shattering on the pristine white carpet in a splash of crimson that looked like blood. The award is for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action. During Operation Thunderstrike 3 weeks ago, the colonel continued, his tone as flat and factual as if he were reading a morning briefing. Under direct and sustained enemy fire, you established a forward aid station, commanding your medical team to treat and stabilize all 47 wounded soldiers of Alpha Company. Your actions saved every single one of them. I watched Daniel's face. The color drained from it, leaving a waxy, pale sheen under the restaurant's dim lights. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The hero of the family, the brave paratrooper, looked like a frightened child. The colonel was not finished. His voice was relentless, a hammer of truth striking again and again. The citation makes special note of your personal actions, without regard for your own safety, to advance on a critically wounded officer, extracting him from the direct line of fire. The officer had sustained massive blood loss, and by all medical accounts would not have survived a delay of even 1 more minute. A dead, suffocating silence fell over the room. You could have heard a pin drop on the blood-stained carpet. Then came the final, devastating blow. "The records confirm," the colonel said, his voice ringing with the finality of a judge's gavel. "The name of that officer was First Lieutenant Daniel Harper." He paused for a beat, letting the words sink in, letting them detonate. "His sister saved his life. The United States Army thanks you for your service. Congratulations, Captain." The line went dead. Every word had been a nail hammered into the coffin of my family's narrative. Daniel staggered back, his hand fumbling for the wall to keep himself from falling. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, frantic horror. It was a look of pure, unadulterated panic, of shame, of a man whose entire world, whose very identity, had just been ripped to shreds by a truth he could no longer deny. He owed his life, his next breath, to the desk jockey he had so proudly mocked. After Colonel Reynolds' call ended, a silence unlike any I had ever experienced descended upon the room. It wasn't an absence of sound, it was a presence. A heavy, suffocating thing that felt like lead, pressing down on everyone, filling the space where laughter and boasting had been just moments before. The adrenaline that had surged through me began to recede, leaving behind a profound, almost unnerving calm. I felt like a surgeon after a long and difficult operation, exhausted but clear-headed. Surveying the aftermath of a necessary but destructive procedure, I let my gaze sweep across the room, observing the wreckage. Daniel was still propped against the far wall, his face a ghastly shade of white. He stared at the floor, at the spreading crimson stain on the carpet, as if it held the answers to a universe that no longer made sense. He looked broken. My mother had both hands pressed to her mouth, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. But as I looked at her, I couldn't tell what her tears were for. Were they for my years of pain, which she had just been forced to witness? Or were they tears of shame for the public humiliation of her golden son? I realized with a pang of cold certainty that I would never know, and stranger still, that I no longer needed to. And my father, my proud, stoic father, the man whose approval I had chased my entire life, just stood there, frozen. He looked like a statue carved from regret, his face suddenly ancient and powerless. For the first time in my life, he didn't look like a giant. He just looked like an old man. The rest of them, Jessica, Sergeant Walsh, the crowd of former classmates, all became a blur of averted eyes and sudden intense interest in their wine glasses or the patterns on the ceiling. They couldn't look at me. They couldn't look at my family. The truth had rendered them all silent, unwilling accomplices to a cruelty they had applauded just moments earlier. Their silence was a confession more damning than any apology. I didn't wait for one. An apology, I knew, would be a desperate, self-serving attempt to patch the gaping wound that had just been torn open. It wouldn't be for me, it would be for them. It would be a plea for me to make it all okay again, to reset the board and allow them to return to their comfortable delusions. I was done being the person who made things okay for everyone else at my own expense. I remember the words of an old army chaplain, a kind man with weary eyes, who had counseled many soldiers through grief. Sometimes, Captain, he'd told me once, the most loving thing you can do for someone is to hold them accountable for their actions, to let them sit with the consequences. It's a painful love, but it's a true one. With his words echoing in my heart, I took a deliberate step forward, my polished shoes sinking slightly into the thick carpet. I walked toward the epicenter of the blast, toward my parents and my brother. They looked up as I approached, their faces a mixture of fear and shock. I stopped a few feet from them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My words were calm, measured, and carried the weight of a final judgment. "I didn't do it for a medal," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. "I didn't do it to be praised or to be a hero." I let my eyes rest on each of them in turn. I did it because it was my duty. I did it because it was my oath to the soldiers by my side. That is all. I paused, letting the words settle. "The only thing I ever wanted from you," I continued, my voice still quiet but unyielding, "was respect, not as a hero, just as a daughter, as a sister." Then I looked directly at Daniel. I met his wide, panicked eyes, and I did not flinch. For the first time, he was the one who looked away. "You owe your life to a desk jockey," I said. That was all. There was nothing more to say. There were no more arguments to be won, no more points to be made. The truth had been spoken. The boundary had been drawn. I turned my back on them, on all of it. I didn't look back to see their reactions. I didn't wait for a response. I walked a straight, unwavering line toward the heavy glass doors, my footsteps the only sound in the cavernous, silent room. I could feel every eye in the place on my back, but for the first time, their judgment felt powerless. It couldn't touch me. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool, clean night air. The door swung shut behind me, the soft thud echoing the final, merciful end of a lifetime of struggle. I had left the wreckage of their lies and their pride behind me, and as I walked alone across the vast, empty parking lot, I felt a profound sense of release. I was finally, irrevocably free. The weeks that followed the reunion were quiet, The phone didn't ring. There were no pleading text messages, no dramatic emails demanding an explanation. There was only a profound and resounding silence from Raleigh. I knew my family needed time to process the rubble of the world they had built. And I realized with a sense of calm acceptance that I needed time too, time to let the silence be silence instead of an absence I desperately needed to fill. The Silver Star ceremony was held on a bright, breezy afternoon at Fort Bragg. It wasn't a grand affair. It was a formal but intimate gathering in a small auditorium, attended by my commanding officers and a handful of colleagues, including Lisa, who stood in the front row, her smile small but genuine. Colonel Reynolds pinned the medal to the chest of my dress uniform. The piece of metal felt heavy and cool through the fabric. "We're proud of you, Captain," he said, his voice firm and sincere. It was a moment of immense honor, and I was grateful. But as I stood there, I understood something with absolute clarity. My peace, the true steady sense of self-worth I had fought so hard for, didn't come from this medal. It didn't come from the applause, however earnest it was. It didn't come from the validation of the White House or the United States Army. My peace came from the quiet, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor in the recovery room. It came from the controlled, focused intensity of the operating theater, where rank and reputation dissolved and only skill and teamwork mattered. It came, surprisingly, from the look of dawning comprehension on the face of a young medical resident, as I guided his hands to properly insert a central venous catheter for the first time. My purpose wasn't a story to be told. It was a life to be lived, a job to be done. It was here, in the antiseptic-smelling halls of Womack Army Medical Center, surrounded by the men and women who understood the silent language of service and sacrifice. This was my world. This was my truth. And here, no one could ever devalue or diminish it. I hadn't just found allies. I had found my real family. A family forged not by blood, but by shared purpose and mutual respect. One afternoon, while sorting through a stack of interdepartmental mail, I found a personal letter addressed to me. It had come through the military mail system, the envelope plain and unassuming. There was no return address. Curious, I slid it open. Inside was a single sheet of folded notebook paper. The handwriting was a rough, almost childish scrawl, the kind of script made by a hand more accustomed to holding a rifle than a pen. The letter read, "Dr. Harper, I was one of the 47 guys in Alpha Company. I don't remember much about that night after the blast. I remember the noise and the pain, and I remember thinking I was going to die. But then I remember your voice. You were yelling orders, but you were calm. You kept talking to me. While your hands were working, you kept me from panicking. Thank you for giving me the chance to see my little girl again. A grateful soldier." I read the letter 3 times, my fingers tracing the clumsy, heartfelt words. A wave of emotion, so powerful and pure it took my breath away, washed over me. This was it. This single anonymous piece of paper held more weight, more value, more honor than any polished medal or public accolade. I carefully folded the letter and tucked it into the chest pocket of my scrubs, right over my heart. It felt warmer and heavier than the Silver Star. That night, as I drove home, I thought about the oath I took when I graduated from medical school. The Hippocratic Oath. There's a line in it that had always resonated with me. I will remember that there is art to medicine as well as science, and that warmth, sympathy, and understanding may outweigh the surgeon's knife or the chemist's drug. My legacy would not be the story told at a high school reunion, a tale of heroes and footnotes. It would not be defined by my family's limited perception or by the glittering prizes of a military career. My legacy was the quiet, unseen art of medicine. It was the calm voice in the middle of chaos. It was the steady hand guiding a nervous resident. It was a father somewhere in America, tucking his daughter into bed at night. My legacy was in the lives that continued, and in that quiet, profound realization, I found all the glory, all the honor, and all the peace I would ever need. My journey taught me a difficult but liberating lesson. Sometimes the family we're born into isn't the one that ultimately heals us. It's the family we choose, the colleagues, the friends, the quiet allies who see our worth when we can't see it ourselves. That's why I wanted to share my story with you. And it makes me want to ask you, who is the Lisa Chen in your life? The person who offered you a hand or a kind word when you needed it most. Sharing these stories of resilience is so important. If you agree, please support the channel that made telling my story possible. Consider subscribing, and I would be truly honored to read about your own moments of strength and connection in the comments below.